Welcome. Good to be here. So if we're going to talk about the merits or the lack thereof of evolution, we need to know what it is. So let's talk about that. What is evolution? There are four kinds of evolution that people talk about, and the first kind is cosmological evolution, talking about Big Bang, stars, galaxies, planets, etc. Second kind, geological evolution, rock layers, fossils, tectonic plates, etc. Third kind, chemical evolution, life arising spontaneously from non-living chemicals. And biological evolution, from bacteria to fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, etc. So those are the four that science out there talks about, secular science talks about. So we're going to talk, there's way too much to talk about in one evening, but let's talk about one of those, the last one. Biological evolution. Does it have merit? What is it really? We have to answer that before we can evaluate it. Okay, so evolution, this is an important definition, and the highlighted things there are the four things that we'll talk about tonight. Evolution is a gradual genetic improvement in heritable characteristics. Heritable characteristics means you can inherit it from your parents in successive generations of living organisms. Changes in genetic material are caused by random and undirected mutations. That's a huge, important piece. And the gradual improvement of a species, or the change of one species into another, is brought about by natural selection, also known as survival of the fittest. The continuance of beneficial mutations and the weeding out of harmful ones. Now there's an awful lot there, and each piece, each of these highlighted phrases could go quite some time, but let's look at them one at a time. So random and undirected mutations. By the way, in all of these discussions tonight, evolutionists are not the bad guys. They're not the enemy. The body of Christ has not represented Christ very well over the last couple thousand years, so it's very understandable that a lot of people don't want to be like us. We have dropped the ball in numerous ways. So evolutionists are following a very predictable course of action based on how we have represented Christ, well or not. So keep in mind, evolutionists also are created in God's image, in His likeness. They are people that Jesus died for. They have value, they have dignity, they have purpose, they have significance, even though they themselves don't believe it yet, because they think they evolved by accident. So let's talk about this random and undirected. What does that mean? It means there's no intention. You don't want to do anything, because if people evolve by random, undirected changes, that means it wasn't trying to do anything. This is random. There are no goals. I don't want to get to a certain point. There are no decisions. Let's say, would this be better or would that be better? There's no intelligence. I can't evaluate anything and make a choice based on whether something makes sense or not. There's no foresight. In other words, what would happen if I did this? Would that be good or would that be bad? There's no planning. Let's see, if I'm going to do this, then I'll need to do that first. One example I give is, suppose you're doing some remodeling at home, and you put up the drywall, and you put the mud in the cracks, and you put up the texturing, and then the primer, and then the paint, and then you realize, oh yeah, got to put in the wiring and the plumbing. There is an order of things. That's the planning part. But there's none of that, and you can't even have awareness if evolution is really, if that was a thing. Why? Because all those processes require a mind, an overseeing, overarching mind to have this intention or goal or decision, etc. So evolutionists really, really resist that idea of an overseeing mind that made things happen. Evolution requires and assumes naturalism, which by its definition excludes anything supernatural. Supernatural means beyond natural. So naturalism, by its definition, wouldn't allow that. No overarching, over-supervising mind is allowed. So think about, you couldn't even build a doghouse that way. Now let's look at that. You can't have any intention, like, I don't mean to build a doghouse. You can't have any goals. Do I want to have a doghouse? You can't make any decisions. Am I going to build a doghouse? Can't have any intelligence. What does a doghouse look like? You can't have any foresight. Why would I build a doghouse? You can't have any planning. What do I need for a doghouse? You can't even have any awareness. What's a dog? Now, imagine trying to build a doghouse without intention, goals, decisions, intelligence, foresight, planning, or awareness. You can't even toast a piece of bread like that. So, but it's really an attractive idea for people out there, especially if they haven't heard any alternative views. One of the reasons that evolution has gotten a hold as tightly as it has on the world's mindset, I think, is because we use the term really sloppily. We don't use it consistently. For example, you can look on a search engine for the evolution of a computer. Yeah. Now there's the ENIAC on the left from 1945 or so, and there's a MacBook there on the right. Now, do we really think that turned into that with no goals, no decisions, no intelligence, no planning, no awareness? Seriously, no. That evolution is not evolution. Yeah. There were some very smart people with goals in mind using very sophisticated machines to attain a particular goal, and on and on and on. The evolution of a car, did that turn into that with no planning, no awareness, no goals, no intelligence, no awareness? Of course not. The evolution of the telephone, did that turn into that without any of those things? We use those phrases or that word evolution so inconsistently. It seems like, well, sure, evolution exists because phones used to look like that, and now they look like that. But that whole idea falls apart if you actually think about it. Mm-hmm. But there is a resistance to critical thinking. Okay, so what's wrong with those pictures? Does anybody, okay, I just said that. Does anybody really believe that those products came about with no goals, no intention, no intelligence, no conscious decisions, only random, undirected changes? Of course not. Okay, so that's the random and undirected part. So let's look at the next one. The gradual improvement of a species. Gradual improvement. Now, the improvement thing is a problem. The second law of thermodynamics talks about how everything degrades, decays, falls apart, rusts, dies, and now when Adam and Eve sinned, it's not that the entire second law of thermodynamics came into existence, but the destructive parts. Because you need the second, you couldn't even heat a pot of tea without the second law of thermodynamics. So it existed, but it wasn't destructive until Adam and Eve sinned, and then decay came into the world. Yeah. Okay, so everything tends to go from order to disorder, which is why things run down, wear out, die, break, rust, decay, fall apart. Now, the Bible has a really, really good description of this. The creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. Bondage to decay is a really good description of the second law of thermodynamics, the damaging parts, the decaying parts, the kind that came into existence when Adam and Eve sinned. Creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. So we're not there yet, because probably, well, I probably shouldn't go there because that'll take another. There is so much stuff here. Okay, the gradual improvement of a species that evolution supposedly causes, because of the second law of thermodynamics, random and undirected changes unavoidably damage things. Now, random and undirected. So suppose you had any kind of a machine, and you threw rocks at it from random angles, random sized rocks from random angles. Would you improve it? Think about that. Imagine your computer, and you just kind of take this chunk of the hard drive and scramble the bits and put it back. And then you take this chunk and scramble the bits and put it back. Would you improve the functionality? No, it would hang and be a doorstop from then on. Random and undirected changes never improve things, and evolution ignores that. So the next piece, natural selection. Now, natural selection actually is a thing, and it is part of the biblical creation model, but an important thing there, an important aspect of that, is that natural selection tends to weed out mutated, damaged organisms, and it can only preserve existing information. It cannot innovate. That's right. It's like shuffling a deck of cards. If you have a standard deck of cards, 4 suits, 13 cards apiece, you can shuffle it any way you want, but you still only have 52 cards. Macroevolution implies suddenly you can shuffle them and there's a new deck, or a new suit, or a new pip value. Microevolution is a new combination of existing traits. That's like shuffling the cards and dealing them. Macroevolution means new functional genetic information is coming from, well, somewhere. And that is a really important point, because how do you get new functional genetic information? DNA is incredibly complex, more complex than any program or operating system that humans have ever come up with, and it wrote itself. Think about that. So macroevolution is like taking a standard deck of 4 suits, 13 pip values apiece, shuffling them, and then you have 5 suits of 18 pip values apiece. Where did the information come from? No, that has to be created on purpose to have a new suit or new things. So microevolution versus macroevolution. Since microevolution does not add genetic information, but macroevolution requires it, these are apples and oranges. You can't compare them accurately. Macroevolution says, starting with 1, 0 is added enough times to get 2. Because microevolution just shuffles what you have. Macroevolution says you have to come up with new stuff. And that's the stuff that has never been seen. Never been seen. We'll talk about more about that later. Okay, so the next one is beneficial mutations versus harmful mutations. Because remember, this is random and undirected changes. Cosmic rays come flying in, high energy particles, high energy photons, and bump atoms around. And there's beneficial mutations and harmful mutations. Both are conceivable. What actually happens? So beneficial mutations would be required by the trillions in order to evolve a bacterium into a person, for example. Because the only difference between a bacterium and a person is the information in the DNA. where did all the information come from? Information has to come from intelligence. Information cannot come from naturalistic processes. Trouble is, no one has ever seen a beneficial mutation. Now, those are random mutations, but nobody has ever seen a beneficial mutation when they're trying to make a beneficial mutation. There have been experiments, genetic experiments, where they say, okay, let's take this amino acid out and put another one in. Oh, it breaks it. Okay, let's take that one out and put this one in. Oh, that breaks it too. Let's take that one out and put this one in. Oh, that breaks it too. No matter what kind of adjustments they make, it always causes damage. So no one has ever seen a beneficial mutation. But there are more than 6,000 harmful disease-causing mutations known now, and more being discovered every year. Even evolutionists admit that there's no more than 1 in 10,000 mutations is beneficial. Now, they've never seen one, but they have to acknowledge that it's more than 0, otherwise the whole theory falls apart. So they say, well, okay, they happen once in a while, like 1 every 10,000 mutations, but think about that. How can we make any progress ahead if we take 9,999 steps backwards for each 1 step forward? Think about that. If 1 out of every 10,000 mutations is beneficial, and remember, you can't do any planning, you can't do any thinking about it, so you can't make the beneficial one really, really big, and all of the damaging, harmful ones teeny. So you're just stuck. Okay, another aspect of this question of evolution, the value of it. Evolution requires great amounts of time. Well, because, you know, if you leave your Model T out in the yard, exposed to the weather, for a week, it won't turn into a Maserati. But maybe it could in 1,000,000 years, or 1,000,000,000 years. Has anybody ever heard of rust? But uniformitarianism, because it's so obvious, you can't do this overnight. That would be just magic, and that's just unacceptable. But because you can see it, you can test it. That's an important point. You leave your Model T out for a week, and it doesn't turn into a Maserati. Okay, so it won't happen quickly. How do we know? Because we can watch it. So let's pretend that it happened over billions and billions of years where you can't see it. Therefore, you can't disprove it. That's convenient. So uniformitarianism is the belief that the universe came to be in its current state via continuous, uniform processes over long periods of time. Now, these long periods of time are absolutely necessary because you can't see them. And therefore, you can imagine all sorts of things happening in them. Catastrophism is a belief that some short-term exceptional occurrences, like creation itself or the flood, contributed to the current state of the universe. And the Bible does promote catastrophism, because it says, like there he is, Matthew said a few minutes ago, in the beginning God created. That's not something that happens. God didn't create the universe every day for the last 100 years. He did it once. And then things happened. I mean, then natural laws took over, and then because of sin, God sent the flood, and things happened. But that was an exceptional occurrence. That's catastrophism, not uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism requires enormous expanses of time, which is called deep time, because the complexity that we see everywhere could not have come about overnight. Oh, there's my example. My Model T couldn't spontaneously turn into a Maserati overnight, but maybe in 1,000,000 years it could. And that is actually the thinking of behind the necessity for deep time. Because if we have enough time, who knows what magical things could happen. But uniformitarianism and deep time really, really are not helpful to believers in evolution, because it consistently backfires. Because we can, like Matthew was talking about, observational science. We can do this experiment, measure how fast things happen, and say, okay, we can see how fast this happens, and if we extrapolate it back 4.5 billion years for the solar system or 13 billion years for the universe, we get ridiculous answers. But if uniformitarianism is a thing, then it had to happen in a uniform way. For example, salt in the oceans. We can measure how much salt is going into the oceans by measuring the salt in rivers that are going into the oceans. We can measure how much is coming out, and therefore we can see if we started with absolutely no salt in the oceans and it's coming in at this rate, as uniformitarianism requires, it would have been toxic to all life ages ago, eons ago. Same thing with nickel in the oceans, carbon dating. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Here's an example of it, the candlestick problem. You walk into a room and you see a burning candle. You measure it to be 13 inches tall. An hour later, it's 12 inches tall. Another hour later, it's 11 inches tall. So you think, okay, I can measure this. It is getting shorter at 1 inch per hour. Then an evolutionist walks in and says, that candle has been burning for a year. Is that reasonable? How do you know?
Big candle.
Oh yeah, that's a really honking candle. If the candle had been burning for a year, it would have been 730 feet tall 1 year ago. If it had been burning for a year, it would not have been able to support its own weight, and the base would shatter. Are there little crumbles of shattered wax? Nope, there aren't those. A year's worth of melting wax would form a huge cone of drippings at the base. Is there a huge cone of drippings? Nope. Okay. Well, there would be a hole through the ceiling and the roof to accommodate a 730-foot candle. Is there? Oh, there isn't.
There might be some holes in this room.
The size of a candle? If the candle had been burning for a year, it would have broken off from wind gusts. I mean, candle wax is not that strong structurally. So it would have broken off because of wind. A 730-foot candle would have been snuffed out by wind and rain that high. So if we assume deep time, you run into all sorts of problems. That's the kind of problems you're going to run into over and over and over, because it doesn't track. You can measure this, and if you extrapolate it back, you get something that is way, way, way less than what deep time claims. So many observable, measurable processes lead to ridiculous conclusions if we apply uniformitarianism and deep time consistently. And this is a partial list, that if you assume uniformitarianism and deep time, you get something that contradicts, by measurable, repeatable observations and experimentation, you get things that contradict the theory that we've been here 4.5 billion years or 13.8 billion years, etc. Well, some people say, well, maybe God used evolution. Is that possible? No. Why isn't it? Isn't he powerful enough? That's very good, yes. But even if you didn't know that, this would obviously be a no answer. Could God have used evolution to create the universe? Remember what evolution is. It's undirected, no goals, no intention, no mind, no planning, which means if God, it's not that God somehow lacks the power or the know-how, it's the question that is irrational. God's creation of the universe included intention, goals, decisions, foresight, awareness. In all those things that evolution, by its very definition, doesn't allow, it doesn't permit it, because evolution is undirected. So if you want to consider the possibility, did God use evolution to create everything, that means he would have to direct an undirected process. Can God direct something without directing it? No, that doesn't even make sense. So God cannot use evolution to create stuff, because evolution is, by its very definition, undirected, and therefore you can't have goals, intention, awareness, all of that stuff. If it's evolution, it cannot be directed. If it's directed, it cannot be evolution. So, what is evolution? It is a hypothetical process that contradicts numerous laws of physics. It's inconsistent with repeatable observations and experimentations. It is supported only by evidence that would not stand up in court. And there are some honest evolutionists that I've read, and they said, I would so hate to try to defend this in court. But that's the only way they can get funding, because of the political machine behind it. And evolution is attractive only to people who want a reason to keep God out of their lives. I mean, if you look at a plant, if you look at a bug, if you look at a person or an animal or the sky, like Romans 1 says, you know somebody built that, because it is so intricate, it is so complex, it cannot possibly be an accident that was just really, really lucky. So that is the end of part 1.